All right, team, welcome. Because my fourth period had suckered me into recording this lecture on a Friday night, I'm going to do it before I get on with my life. So, the topics that I'm going to cover in this lecture, I'm going to rehash, I guess, these important years. I'm going to go over the Southern colonies again, and I'm also going to cover the Native American conflicts. All right, and I'll be able to close any gaps with Native American conflicts come Monday, and also move into colonial society on Monday as well. Make sure that you have your reading done though, which I linked on your period 2 homework sheet. Uh, let's see what else. That's pretty much it, I guess. Some of these important years, if you take a look at the screen here, keep in mind 1491 was natives before Columbus. 1492 was the year that Christopher Columbus actually arrived. 1607 was the year that Jamestown was founded. 1619 was the year that the House of Burgesses was created, and that is the first representative form of government in the American colonies, or in the British colonies, I should say. And that's incredibly significant because it kind of paves the way for what will become eventually the United States and what will develop into the U.S. Congress many years later, over 100 years later, I should say. Um, in 1620, we have the Mayflower Compact, and that was the document that was signed aboard the Mayflower when the Puritans, or if you want to call them the Pilgrims or whatever, they were outnumbered by the other people, the people that didn't necessarily believe like them, but they said we have to get someone to, we have to get these people to sign this contract and sign this compact so that they could have power, right? So that people would submit to their laws because they wanted to set up a religious form of government, which we know as a theocracy. And so they get people to sign that, and that is incredibly significant because that is the document that shows that people submit to be governed. People submit to be governed, and this idea that the government gets its power from the people to an extent because they are agreeing to be governed, and that is what makes the Mayflower Compact so important. And so that's 1620. In 1639, we get the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, Connecticut being one of the New England colonies. And what the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut represents is this first written constitution in the Americas. Even though the United States did not exist yet, it's important in kind of paving the way for what will become the U.S. Constitution in the further history. All right, so 1639 is the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. 1675 is King Philip's War, and I'm going to talk a little bit about King Philip's War today. And then we have 1676, which is Bacon's Rebellion. And remember, Bacon's Rebellion is what we kind of went in depth on that. You had some reading on that. We spent a whole class on that, looking at documents, and plus we had that Tim Wise lecture that we looked at. And keep in mind the significance, or the conflict in Bacon's Rebellion is twofold, right? Like you have the poor against the Native Americans, but you also have the poor against the wealthy. And when we're saying poor, we mean poor whites and poor blacks are unifying. This puts the fear into the white elite class. And so what they do is they begin this racialization of the institution of slavery, that they're phasing out indentured servitude, which was that contract labor system, and moving more towards African slaves, and there will not be a contract. Instead, now they will be enslaved for life, in bondage for life. Let's see here. Settling the lower south. Sorry, my little thing's in the way. That over there. Settling the lower south. Again, what we're going to focus on in South Carolina and Georgia. What we see is from the 1660s through 1730s, South Carolina, or the Carolinas and Georgia are developed. We have a lot of planters in this area, a lot of farmers. Obviously, they're going there with the purpose of creating some form of profit through the form of agriculture. Now, when we're also talking about southern colonies, keep in mind Chesapeake is in fact a southern colony. We just handle them differently because obviously they have more significance in some regard. But we're going to talk also a bit about the West Indies. In Georgia in particular, we have the debtors and the petty criminals. And I talked in class a bit about, the jail sentences and the prison sentences for those who ended up in debt. These are the cash crops or the staple crops of the Carolinas. Indigo, remember that's for the dye, the blue dye and the purplish dye, and obviously rice. And rice will also be a focus of Georgia as well, or Georgia. Founder of Georgia, James Oglethorpe. Remember, the reason it is founded is not only for profit, but he wants to show that prisoners can be reformed. And so that's the importance of Georgia, that he didn't like the way prisoners were treated in England, and so he comes and establishes Georgia for the purpose of prison reform, to give these prisoners, these newly released prisoners, kind of this new start on life. Right? They'll become planters, they'll become farmers, they'll own slaves. And because these people are kind of on the low rung of society compared to other British people, they are used as a buffer zone. They are essentially a first line of defense to protect the other British colonies from the Carolinas on up from Spanish Florida and potentially any other attacks that they might face, even from Native Americans. Now we have again, rice was a major staple crop. Slavery was a major issue in the West Indies and Barbados. There was lots of sugar cane that was grown, and again, all of that is dependent upon the system of enslavement in which they used African people. We talked in class about the slave codes being developed, and remember I gave you guys the example of drums being outlawed, and since they got rid of drums, they had to black slaves use their hands, and how that's kind of been passed on throughout our culture. The slave codes regulated the behavior of slaves. It made them subordinate to their owners and subordinate to the white race. And so what it does essentially is it creates this condition and this culture of subordination. And I already talked about Georgia and prison reform. Now moving into the middle colonies, the purpose of the middle colonies would be for profit as well as individual betterment. When we talk about individual betterment, we're talking about self-development. We're talking about ways of enriching ourselves and becoming better people. A lot of the middle colonies look very similar to how some of these cities look today. When we think about Philadelphia, we think about New York, Newark, etc. Economic diversity. People are making money in a variety of different ways. We have merchants, fishers, shippers, shipbuilders, farmers, etc. Very, very large cities, obviously, like the major cities that I just named. Slavery is something that exists in the middle colonies. It's a common misconception that slavery did not exist in the North. It absolutely did exist in the North. Now, it was abolished in the North, in some northern areas, much earlier than it was in the South, but there were still northern states. Even when the United States was created, there's still northern states that had slavery even during the Civil War, so just be mindful of that. But when we're talking about the colonial era, slavery is something that exists in the middle colonies, and it's not overwhelmingly, slaves are not overwhelmingly represented, but it's pretty significant. There's a lot of ethnic and religious diversity. Ethnic in terms of different types of immigration, lots of Germans, Scots, Irish, etc. Religious diversity. People tried to, at least they tried to pride themselves on being religiously tolerant, but still we have this idea that Jews are not welcome. In some areas, Catholics are not welcome. Stuff like that. Here are some of our middle colonies. Again, we have Delaware, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. Now, one of your key words was homogenous society. That just means a kind of this diverse society, this idea that there are people from all walks of life, ethnic diversity, social diversity, people of different economic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, etc. Pennsylvania is probably the area in which you'd be most often to receive a question on. And again, keep in mind that Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, hence Pennsylvania. And they are known for being pretty tolerant people. and they are founded for the purpose of having this religious haven for the Quakers, people who of Quaker faith who are Christians. They're very kind of these traditional Christians. I don't want to say conservative Christians because they're very liberal in some ways in terms of politics and progressivism, but they are very traditional. They also, to give you an example of how they can be very traditional but also pretty progressive, they're progressive in the way that they see women as equals, right, in their church. But at the same time, uh, they are traditional in the sense that they are very strict followers of their faith. So essentially, what they do is they may interpret their scripture differently than some Puritans, which in that effect makes them a bit more tolerant in some areas. Here is a painting of William Penn. Always associate the Holy Experiment with William Penn. All the Holy Experiment is his idea to create this haven and this colony for those of the Quaker faith. Now, keep in mind that even if you weren't a Quaker, you were welcome in Pennsylvania. All right, so Pennsylvania was not just for Quakers, it was simply founded for Quakers. And so there were people of all religious backgrounds that were there, um, primarily religious backgrounds that were welcomed by those of the Quaker faith, obviously. So the Holy Experiment, again, is this religious movement of sorts, or this religious project of William Penn in order to say that he can create a Quaker colony and it can be successful and they can have tolerance and they can have freedom. Some more information on Penn's Holy Experiment. Essentially, this is what the Pennsylvania experience will be like. He has a very good relationship with the Native Americans. He buys land from the Native Americans instead of just taking the land. So we already notice a difference there. Quakers are welcome for the most part in Native American land because they aren't seen as a threat. They respect the Native Americans so they can walk freely on Native American land without, fear of being attacked. That's not the same for those who are non-Quakers because they're going into these Native American lands and territories without the same attitude and without the same lens. There is a freedom of worship for people in Pennsylvania as long as you are not Jewish or Catholic. And the Catholicism piece came from the pressure from England because we talked a bit in class about that pressure as a result of that religious tension that exists between Protestants and Catholics. Remember, whenever you think about that religious tension, just think about Henry VIII creating the Church of England and the daughters that he produced, Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. Death penalty is something that was utilized in Pennsylvania, utilized primarily for murder and treason if you're some kind of traitor. And there aren't any immigration restrictions. Like I said, when we talked about the middle colonies, it's a very homogenous society. So there are people of a variety of different ethnic backgrounds. So many different people are going to be welcomed here. And one thing that the Quakers are especially known for, besides their oatmeal, is that they are anti-slavery. So when we get to the 1800s, you'll remember me kind of talking about them in a way that they are some of our early abolitionists. And don't forget the story I told in class about our second president, John Adams, who was so disgusted, he and his wife were so disgusted that the White House was built by African slaves because in their faith, that is immoral and that is a sin. I already talked about the immigrants from Germany. They exported a lot of crops, particularly what we would consider cereal crops like wheat, hence oatmeal. And again, the important thing to know about New York would be the Dutch story, and that's simply that the Dutch didn't really put up a fight. Back when New York was New Amsterdam, Duke of York showed up and said, "Yo, I'm gonna take this land. This is mine now," and the Dutch was like, "All right, peace out." Now, looking at the political aspect of this and the development of self-government, um, a lot of this development is a result of their distance from Great Britain. When you're across a very large pond like that, obviously Great Britain cannot keep that close of an eye on you. So what we have here is the development of this lax tension, or what we would call salutary neglect. What this is it's a hands-off approach of to the colonies, where New England, or I'm sorry, not New England, but Great Britain has these laws that they want the colonies to follow, and technically these laws are on the book, but they may not be enforced 100% of the time. And remember the example that I gave in class there. When it comes to colonial government, there are town meetings and elected legislatures. In order to vote, you have to be white landowning church members, because New England is a very, very religious society. Um, when it comes to areas of the middle colonies, in some regard, that will be very similar to them as well. And again, when we talk about New England, the significance there would be the Mayflower Compact and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Those are the significant political documents that emerged from New England. Sorry, that took too long. Looking at the southern colonies, the planters obviously organized in government. They had their assemblies where they would meet and kind of hash out some of their disputes and some of their concerns. A big turning point in terms of government in America, and particularly obviously government in the South, would be Virginia's House of Burgesses. First representative government in the British colonies. And keep in mind that in order to be a member of this government, this representative government, you had to be what was known as an elite planter, an elite plantation owner. All right, so white wealthy men were the ones who were represented here. Even though they call it a representative government, the government only reflects the interests and the beliefs and the practices of those who are white wealthy men. These are just some test tips. Some short answer questions that you might get would be about goals of European colonization. What did Europe want to get out of these colonies? Any differences between the British colonies and other colonies? When we say other colonies, we're talking about places like, Spanish Florida and the Spanish Southwest and the Dutch. Those would be multiple choice questions, and then you'd be given some kind of like stimulus to kind of trigger you to and direct you to a response there. You could also have to compare British colonies to each other. So, for example, comparing and contrasting New England colonies with Chesapeake region colonies, or the middle colonies with the southern colonies. And the way that I would address that, middle colonies with southern colonies, would be like particularly looking at their industry, how they survived economically, the types of people that are relocating to those colonies. One thing that I would bring up with the middle colonies especially is the ethnic diversity and the religious tolerance. Potential essays would be the reasons for the development of slavery, and there you could talk about the dependence on free labor really for all of the colonies, right? Because even in the middle colonies, their slavery did exist, and that was considered a very progressive area. And also comparing and contrasting European colonization, like we've done already, right? French, Spanish, and the English. You probably wouldn't get any kind of essays about the Dutch, but you could not throw up, you don't want to throw up, but you could throw in information about the Dutch to add context or to interpret whatever resources you're given. Now we're going to go ahead and move into Native American conflicts, and you notice, some people have brought this up, you noticed in your reading how the page numbers were kind of out of order. I did that intentionally. There are some times where I might make mistakes, but that was definitely intentional because I wanted to make sure that we handled the Native American conflicts together. And I thought a little bit about that. I wanted to make sure that you guys weren't confused, so I wanted to have a special time and place for the Native American conflicts. And so today we're going to start with the Pequot War. And so the Pequot War is really a series of attacks and a series of conflicts that take place from 1636 to 1638, and this is in New England, and this involves the people who are the Puritans, the Pilgrims, right, who come over here saying that they are going to be the ones to, really be representative of what the world and really what England in particular should look like. These are the people who want to purify the church. They believe in visible saints only. They don't want to kneel. Remember, when they're in England, they don't want to kneel beside people who are prostitutes or people who are sinful, etc. And so what ends up happening here with the Pequot War, we have a conflict between the Puritans and the Pequot Indians in terms of control over land. And so the Native Americans there's a group of Native Americans who actually uh, kind of ally themselves with the Puritans, and they take on the Pequot together because the Pequot are pretty powerful. They're a very large group, and because they allied themselves with the Pilgrims or the Puritans, uh, it made the Puritans more powerful. So as these two groups join forces to fight the Pequot, that is something that is really a turning point in American history, because not only does it virtually wipe out the Pequot in New England, but it also demonstrates what the Puritans are capable of. While they talk all of this stuff, right, in their documents, and we see this from their primary source documents, they have this vision for what their colonies should be, but in reality, they're brutal murderers. And so, what we see in the first battle, especially the beginning of this war, they raid the village when these people are sleeping, and they slit the throats of babies, that are 3 months old, or, a year old, 3 years old. Like, they really show no mercy. And so it kind of begs the question, how can you believe so deeply in your faith and then slaughter even children that way? And so, again, this is just Pequot War is just a representative of a series of wars or series of conflicts that take place between the Puritans and the Pequot Indians. And keep in mind, the Puritans had a small group of Native Americans who were allied with them in this conflict. Now, a lot of people, obviously, Thanksgiving is coming up, and that's something that lots of people celebrate and, look forward to. And the thing that a lot of people neglect to mention, especially when you're in elementary school, right? Like, you guys learn about the first Thanksgiving. But what people neglect to mention is that the first Thanksgiving was a celebration of the slaughter of the Pequot Indians. Um, it wasn't necessarily, oh, thank you for teaching us how to plant crops. Like, that's how they teach it in elementary school. But what it was a celebration of the victory over the Pequot natives. So it was a celebration of the slaughter of the Pequot Native Americans and essentially wiping them out of New England. Now, there were still Pequot Native Americans in existence, but they were dramatically decreased in numbers, and a lot of those survivors went and mixed with other area tribes. The Beaver Wars. Um, what the Beaver Wars represent, and think about the fur trade. Anytime you see beaver, just think about the fur trade. The Iroquois, very, very influential group of Native Americans. They are kind of frustrated with European involvement in the colonies, or really in America, I should say. And so they're going to try to control this fur trade. And not only are they going to try to dominate in some regard the Europeans, but they really want to get a hold and control over other Native American groups and kind of assert their influence. And so what it really is during this entire conflict is the Iroquois going to war with other Native American groups such as the Algonquins. There will be an alliance between the Iroquois and the English. And once the Europeans realize how powerful the Iroquois are, the French will also want to form an alliance with them. And so the Iroquois, what they basically do in the Beaver Wars is they go through and they just dominate all these other Native American groups. And again, this is also that they can control the fur trade, because at that time, resources are power, right? Because that translates into money, and they know that the Europeans are going to pay big money to access that fur. And so again, the Iroquois go to war with the Algonquins. They go to war with the Huron. And what this leads to ultimately is the disbursement of the Huron Confederacy, which was an alliance of I think it was about 4 or 5 different Native American groups. And so at the end of the Beaver Wars, the Iroquois control the fur trade. They have European powers who are trying to basically jump on their bandwagon. And we have the Huron Confederacy, which was an alliance of other Native American groups that has dispersed after they were defeated by the Iroquois. Moving to King Philip's War, and remember when I gave you guys those years, King Philip's War starts in 1675, so that was that year of 1675 that came before Bacon's Rebellion. What you see here is a map of the area in which King Philip's War was fought, and you can see the different Indian settlements along with various English settlements that were actually attacked, and you can see just how close some of these were. King Philip, this is an image of him right here. King Philip it's a name that he kind of took on in honor of the relationship really that his father had with the Puritans. So his family was very well liked by the Puritans. He was very well respected, but because of the land grab that the Puritans really got involved in, and really when the English come over, they're trying to gain as much land as possible, and that's making the Native Americans very uncomfortable because it's taking away from their resources, it's pushing them off of their ancestral land, etc. And now some information about King Philip's War. This is also known as Metacom's War. So if you see Metacom, what they're talking about here is King Philip himself. All right. So again, I know that King Philip, it sounds like a European name, but King Philip is a Native American. Sorry, so don't get confused by that. Now, how does this entire conflict start? It starts with the murder of what was known as a praying Indian. And one of your vocabulary words is praying towns. What a praying town was, were these towns that were set up by Puritans in order to convert Native Americans to Christianity. And it was this idea that, they want to make them assimilate to European culture, particularly Puritan culture. And so in these praying towns, you had praying Indians, people who were Native American, but they had left their culture essentially and had adopted the Puritan English culture, become more anglicized, if you will. And so there was a murder that took place of a praying Indian who was from a praying town, and a lot of people had speculated that the Native Americans, particularly the Wampanoag, which was the tribe that King Philip was a part of, that the Wampanoag were involved. And so this leads to a very big conflict, and tensions had already been brewing because of the land grab and also because of what some people would argue is the forced conversion of Native Americans to Christianity. King Philip was not successful in this war. Ultimately, he will lose. He will lose the faith uh, of his followers as well. The Native Americans will essentially start fighting themselves. Many alliances are broken, and as a result, the Native American population is decimated. It's dramatically decreased. And at the end of this war, when this war ends in 1676, what happens is King Philip is killed. His head is chopped off. His head is placed on a spike, and it's paraded around. And his wife and his children are sold into slavery in the West Indies by the Puritans, by these very religious New England Puritans. And again, this is just another example of how you have another Native American group that is very close to being wiped out. And so this is the first major conflict in the New England area since the Pequot War. All right, so after the Pequot War in the 1630s, there is this kind of long period of peace, and then King Philip's War takes place. And now, after King Philip's War, and the devastating end to that, there is also going to be another kind of significant period of peace between Puritans and Native Americans, but that's mostly because so many of the Native Americans have been wiped out or sent away as slaves. Another conflict that's really important is the Pueblo Revolt, and we kind of hit that in period 1, but the Pueblo Revolt actually takes place during period 2. Pueblo Revolt may also be referred to as Pope's Rebellion. It's the same thing. Keep in mind, the Pueblo Revolt was against the Spaniards, and ultimately, what happened was the Pueblo were successful, and this is in the Southwest. The Pueblo were successful in this revolt, and so they're going to be able to keep the Spaniards out for about 12 years or so. But when the Spaniards come back, because they are so powerful, what they come back with is this renewed sense of respect for the Native American people. All right, and that's going to be something else that kind of aids in the mixture of the cultures. And we're going to get to all this on Monday. So there you have it, folks.